The Great War, as it was known, was a conflict unlike any seen before, a cataclysm that reshaped the world in profound ways. It began in the summer of 1914 and lasted for 4 long, brutal years, engulfing nations and continents in its wake. This war changed the map of the world, toppling empires and creating new nations, redrawing borders in ways that still affect us today. The human cost of World War I was staggering, with a scale of loss that was unprecedented. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, leaving behind a legacy of grief and sorrow. Many millions more were wounded, both physically and mentally, their lives forever altered by the horrors they endured. Entire generations of young men were wiped out, families were torn apart, and communities were devastated by the loss, creating a void that could never be filled. The sheer scale of the suffering was hard to comprehend, leaving deep scars on societies across the globe, scars that would take decades to heal. The war also revolutionized the nature of combat, introducing new technologies and strategies. Traditional methods of fighting proved useless against new weapons, leading to unprecedented levels of destruction. Understanding World War I is crucial to understanding the 20th century, as its impacts are still felt in our world today. The summer of 1914 was a tense time in Europe, with political tensions and alliances creating a fragile peace. Underlying rivalries simmered beneath the surface of daily life as nations eyed each other warily. On June 28th, a single event ignited the flames of war, changing the course of history forever. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was visiting Sarajevo, a city on edge. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and Sarajevo was in Bosnia, a region annexed by Austria-Hungary, causing resentment among the local population. A group of young Serbian nationalists, driven by a desire for independence, plotted to assassinate the Archduke. Their first attempts failed that day, but later, by a strange twist of fate, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn, sealing his fate. It stopped right in front of one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip, who was waiting for his moment. Princip seized his chance and fired 2 shots, changing the world in an instant. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were killed, their lives cut tragically short. The news of their deaths spread quickly across Europe, sending shockwaves through the capitals of the great powers and setting the stage for a global conflict. After the initial battles, the war on the Western Front bogged down into a grueling stalemate. Both the Allied powers, including France and Britain, and the Central powers, primarily Germany, dug elaborate systems of trenches, stretching for hundreds of miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border, creating a vast network of defensive positions. These trenches became the grim symbols of World War I, representing the futility and horror of the conflict. Soldiers lived in these ditches for weeks, sometimes months at a time, enduring harsh and unforgiving conditions. This new form of warfare was static and incredibly deadly, with progress measured in yards, often at a terrible cost in human lives, with thousands perishing for minimal gains. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. They were often cold, wet, and filled with mud. Heavy rains would turn the trenches into quagmires, and soldiers endured constant shelling and the threat of sniper fire. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, trench foot, and typhus spread quickly in the unsanitary conditions, making survival even more difficult. The stench of death and decay hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the brutal reality of war. World War I was a testing ground for new and terrifying weapons. Industrialization had transformed the way wars were fought, and these new technologies dramatically increased the scale of destruction, making the battlefield more lethal than ever before. Machine guns were a key defensive weapon, capable of firing hundreds of bullets per minute and mowing down waves of attacking soldiers, making frontal assaults incredibly costly. Artillery also became more powerful and accurate, with huge cannons firing massive shells miles into enemy territory. Poison gas was one of the most feared weapons of the war, first used by the Germans in 1915. The war also saw the first widespread use of tanks and airplanes. Section 5. A global conflict beyond the European theatre. World War I was truly a global conflict. While the Western Front in Europe is often the focus, fighting raged across the world. The European powers had vast colonial empires. These empires were drawn into the war. Millions of people from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were involved. They served as soldiers, laborers, and support staff. The war reached far beyond the fields of France and Belgium. It touched continents and peoples often forgotten in popular memory. Colonies provided vital resources and manpower to the warring nations. Soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fought for the British Empire. Troops from French West Africa and Indochina fought for France. Section 6. America joins the fray. Shifting tides. When World War I erupted in 1914, the United States remained neutral. President Woodrow Wilson urged Americans to be impartial in thought as well as in action. Most Americans supported this policy. They saw the war as a European conflict. They wanted to avoid being drawn into the distant bloodshed. Several factors gradually pushed the United States towards war. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare was a major cause. German U-boats sank merchant ships without warning. This included ships carrying American passengers. The sinking of the British liner Lusitania in 1915 killed over 100 Americans. Section 7. The war's end and a fragile peace. By 1918, the tide of war was turning against the Central Powers. Germany launched a series of massive offensives in the spring. They hoped to achieve a decisive victory before American forces arrived in large numbers. These attacks, known as the Spring Offensive, initially made gains, but the German army was exhausted. The Allies, reinforced by American troops, launched a powerful counteroffensive. This 100 Days offensive pushed the Germans back steadily. The end was drawing near. Germany's allies began to collapse. Bulgaria was the first to surrender in September 1918. The Ottoman Empire followed in October. Austria-Hungary, facing internal revolts and military defeat, signed an armistice in early November. Germany itself was in turmoil. Section 8. The Treaty of Versailles and its bitter legacy. In January 1919, leaders of the victorious Allied nations gathered in Paris. They met at the magnificent Palace of Versailles to decide the fate of the defeated powers. The main figures were President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, and Premier Georges Clemenceau of France. Each had different goals for the peace. Wilson sought a peace without victory based on his 14 points. Clemenceau wanted to ensure Germany could never again threaten France. Lloyd George aimed to balance these views. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for causing the war. This was known as the War Guilt Clause. The Treaty of Versailles left a Europe forever altered, sowing seeds of discontent that would later bloom into another devastating conflict. The world had changed irrevocably, and the lessons of the Great War would echo through the decades. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into pivotal moments of our past. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.